So I think we're at 35 participants, which is fantastic. And so I want to respect your energy and your commitment and your timeliness. And let's take a moment to jump into this session. So by way of introduction, my name is Ross Wallace. I am a principal at Santis Health and an advisor to the Resilient Healthcare Coalition. And it is my great pleasure to introduce or to welcome all of you and to make some introductions in a moment, but to welcome all of you to a virtual roundtable on reinvigorating cancer care in Canada, the power and the promise of precision medicine. So I will introduce our participants in one moment, but before I do that, I would like to take a moment to issue a land acknowledgement. And thank you, Louise, for calling this out in your usual wonderful fashion. I wish to acknowledge that we are speaking to you from Toronto, located on the traditional territory of several nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. It is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. We thank them for sharing these lands with us. And we thank all of you for sharing this hour with us. So let me start by making some introductions of the participants from the Resilient Healthcare Coalition who will be kicking things off in terms of this conversation. Then we'll talk a little bit about housekeeping, and then I will turn it to Dr. Gwyn Bebb for some introductory remarks and a conversation with me. So here are the panelists. So we're going to start with Dr. Bebb. Dr. Gwyn Bebb is a medical oncologist who spent 20 years treating lung cancer patients in Vancouver and Calgary, Canada. During that time, he served as the medical lead for the clinical trials unit at the Tom Baker Cancer Center, created a provincial lung cancer database, and established a precision oncology program at the University of Calgary. In September 2022, he took on the role of clinical research medical director at Amgen, based in Thousand Oaks, California, helping to develop new therapies for the treatment of non-small cell and small cell lung cancer. Louise Binder is a health policy consultant at the Save Your Skin Foundation. She's a lawyer and a health advocate who's involved in informing the development of health policy and systemic treatment access practices from the patient perspective. She co-founded the Canadian Treatment Action Council, or CTAC, in 1996. Barry Stein is the president and CEO of Colorectal Cancer Canada. He actively represents the interests of cancer patients, speaks regularly to medical professionals, industry, government, patient groups across Canada and internationally. And Eva Villalba is the executive director of the Coalition Priorité Cancer au Québec. Since 2008, she's been involved in healthcare charities, advocacy groups, and nonprofits. She holds an MBA from RHC Montreal, and last year she received an MSc in Healthcare Transformation from the Value Institute for Health and Care at the University of Texas. So I'm going to pass the microphone to Eva to offer some introductory remarks in a moment. But perhaps we can go to the next slide. I'm just going to make a comment about how I think we can optimize the time we have over the next sort of 55 minutes or so. So just a sort of few rules of order or rules of sort of optimal meeting dynamics. So the first is in Zoom, we have a wonderful platform that allows folks to raise their hand virtually and electronically. Please use this function, and I will be, especially for the open conversation at about the 12:30 mark or so, I will curate a list of speakers and participants, and we'll make sure to have as many voices as possible actively engaged in this discussion. If you're not talking, please mute yourself if you don't mind. That will make it easier for the conversation that is occurring and minimize the likelihood of feedback. Use the chat. So the Santis folks who work with RHC will be moderating the chat, and my colleague Isabella Kaczmarek is going to kick us off with some interesting resources that may be of relevance for folks after this conversation. And hopefully we will be able to use the chat function to augment, supplement, and complement the conversation that's happening over the course of this meeting. And the last thing I would ask you for is to please consider putting your please consider putting your video on. So we've intentionally kept the attendees at this meeting deliberately sort of restricted. So we've got about 35, 40 folks here. We could have had obviously a much larger group, but the goal of this discussion was really to have people engaged with each other. So hopefully this is not one of those meetings where you're doing 8 things at once. Hopefully you can actually take the time and the opportunity to commit to each other with your engagement, with your faces, with your names. And we can ensure that conversation goes as effectively as possible. So there's sort of the rules of order, the rules of play, and my kind of requests for all of you to make this conversation and this discussion go as robustly and as resonantly as possible. And with that, I will pass the microphone to Eva Villalba, who will offer some opening and introductory remarks. And again, hopefully we'll see more and more of you over the course of this time together. Eva.
Thanks so much, Ross. So thank you all for being here. And I think one of the reasons everyone is here is because we're all very interested in both Brazilian healthcare systems and what it has to do with precision medicine and oncology in particular. And since the creation of the Resilient Healthcare Coalition, we've really been focused on two core objectives. One is accelerating and expanding access to health technologies and treatments, and the other is optimizing the use of health data. And precision medicine is really at the intersection of these two objectives. And we see that there's great opportunities, there's also great challenges. The context is really interesting and ripe because we see everything that's happening with the Pan-Canadian Health Data Strategy, and closer to my home in Quebec, we have the Bill 19 on health data. We see that there's an appetite for greater use of health data, but now we have to see, okay, how do we apply it in real life? How does it actually impact the different stakeholders, patients, clinicians, payers, and even industry? And so today, I think we have a great panel to discuss these things and make sense of it, see how everyone can benefit. And so I shoot it back to Ross for the continuation of this very interesting discussion.
Thanks so much, Eva. And for those who are less familiar with the work of the Resilient Healthcare Coalition, Eva and Louise and Barry all sit on our steering committee. You can find more information about the coalition and its work at the intersection of accelerating and expanding access and optimizing healthcare data at resilienthealthcare.ca. So please feel free to reach out to any of them or to myself, and hopefully we will continue to interest and engage you in our work as we go forward. So I'm going to start this conversation by turning to Gwyn, and there's a few things I'd really like to get your perspectives on, and then we'll open it up to the RHC folks, and then I think the real value and power will come when we open it up even more broadly. So with that approach, Gwyn, maybe if I can starting with you, during the worst days of the pandemic, before you made the move to Amgen and you were in Calgary, you were wearing sort of two very important but very different hats. So on the one hand, you were a clinician treating cancer patients, and on the other hand, you were a researcher searching for new treatments, new therapeutics, and those are two incredibly important worlds that are fundamental to precision medicine. But I'm wondering if you just want to think a little bit about that hybrid perspective and some of the learnings or the takeaways that sort of informed your thinking as you went through the darkest days of COVID and as you saw its impact on cancer systems and on cancer patients more specifically.
Well, thanks very much, Ross, for the introductions and certainly the invitation to participate in this. Eva's comments there that hopefully we can make sense of everything, maybe a little bit optimistic. I've certainly been struggling to make sense of many things over the years, but I think it's everybody's perspective is important, and I think we can hopefully align these perspectives in a way that creates a momentum that will affect positive change. So yes, I think the onset of COVID changed things a lot in clinical practice, and certainly it was a huge challenge for the leadership in every provincial healthcare system. The restrictions on access to various institutions caused problems with both family practice visits, specialist visits, and certainly diagnostic workups, whether it was imaging or biopsy obtaining, which is very critical for cancer. For us as practitioners, we saw a massive impact in the clinic, where at one point, really, there were no inpatient visits at all in some of my clinics, and everything was done over the phone. This had a big impact on our ability to track patient side effects, the tolerability of the treatments that we were giving. It had a big impact on some of our research practice of consenting patients, and certainly there's a big downturn in some of the clinical trial activities. I certainly remember at one point anticipating that my phone-in clinics would be a lot quicker than the inpatient visits. But in fact, what we found was that some of these patients had been isolating for so long, they hadn't spoken to anybody since their last visit. And I, as a physician, was the first human they'd interacted with in a long time. And so those conversations took a lot longer than I had anticipated. So, those were some of the challenges that we saw. And I think the ramifications of those challenges are still, causing a little bit of reeling within the healthcare system. as a kind of nadir, I suppose, I'm going to just quote an example of a young man who was diagnosed with metastatic non-small cell lung cancer in 2020. Just at the height of all these COVID restrictions, and there were significant delays in his diagnostic workup. Nevertheless, he got his biopsy, got the marker panel done as per guidelines, and he was marker negative, and I gave him treatment with immunotherapy and chemotherapy, and he did relatively well, as someone in their very early 30s would. But inevitably, within about 14 months, he was progressing again, and we did a rebiopsy, and we're able to use donor-funded precision testing mechanisms that we had put in place within the POET program at the University of Calgary to perform a 170 gene panel test. And I remember the time when the results came back, and I was able to share it with the patients that he had a RET mutation. And this is something actionable. And it was profound because a new treatment had been approved by the FDA several months before. Now, of course, it was not approved yet in Canada. I asked for special access, and I did get permission to get the drug from one of the pharmaceutical companies. And within a couple of weeks, Health Canada had given approval for the drug to be shipped to the country. We then encountered a few bureaucratic hurdles regarding importation of non-approved medicinal products, which of course delayed even further because of COVID. And during this time, the patient deteriorated. He came into hospital. I managed to get him into the ICU for a little bit of support. And I have to say that moment of trying to advocate for my patient, potentially at the expense of other patients who required ICU admission due to their COVID illness, was a particularly galling and emotionally draining time, not just for me, but for many of my colleagues, both in the ICU and on call within the medical oncology system. Unfortunately, the drug didn't get to us in time, and after coming out of the ICU, he did deteriorate, and the drug arrived a few days after he died. Now, I think, although that was COVID related, it did highlight to me some of the challenges that have been a catalyst really for the gathering that we are part of today. And that is of kind of continued challenges in getting rapid access or timely access to drugs for some of our patients, despite progress within the precision oncology realm. And the publication that people have been alluding to, published just a few weeks ago in Oncology Therapeutics, looking at estimating the impact of this delayed access to oncology drugs in Canada, is actually quite an interesting article, because it ties in a lot of the things that we're talking about here: access to data, sharing data, trying to quantify the negative aspects of some of our processes in place. And I think it's worth us noting that Canada has been traditionally very slow in approving new drugs. And there's an additional delay, even after approval, in the funding of these drugs within each healthcare authority. And I think what this publication tried to quantify was the impact of that in terms of 1,700 years of life lost because of a delay in the approval of just 3 very simple drugs. And trying to quantify this in terms of economic impact is I think very important in trying to delineate exactly the problems that we're trying to address. So going back to this, the COVID-related complications, I think the few things that came out of that was the following. We found ways of making clinical trial enrollment more feasible using electronic and remote consenting, for example. The system indeed found ways of making and approving an extended length between visits, making it possible for people to get their IV treatment at more friendly intervals, for example. And looking back at it now, I think there's several positive things that have come out of the COVID experience. Our using Zoom right now is something that we would have been a little bit hesitant had it not been for COVID, in fact. So as we look at this kind of hybrid experience, I think what I would say is that, it identified very personally in that particular case, the challenge that our healthcare system is facing in improving drugs and in pushing the precision oncology agenda forward. And yet it also showed that however clumsy and however slow the oil tanker of processes within the healthcare system is to change, when the right pressure is applied, many people and many processes can actually be very nimble. And I think that may be something we want to capitalize on as we move forward in pushing this agenda right now.
Gwyn, thanks for that. And that is a heartbreaking anecdote that you shared that shows both the power of sort of companion diagnostics and precision medicine, and also the challenges of an access regime that allows the full potential of that system to be realized. Maybe if we sort of take a bit of a deeper dive into the data side of data and access, can you talk a little bit about what you see as the greatest opportunities to get data right? What do you see as sort of most pressing, most promising, most optimistic to move us forward in a better, faster way?
That's a fantastic question, Ross, and we all wish there was a simple answer to that. I think one of the major challenges, of course, is trying to anticipate exactly what information we are going to need in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, and 20 years from now. But I think some of the basic principles that we would do well to look carefully at would be realizing that organizing data in a way that makes it extractable and accessible is very important. Some of the key elements in making that happen are deep thought from experts in how to organize the data in a way that makes it much more easily extractable. This includes a setting up of databases, make them somehow cross-related. It invokes expertise that is outside the boundaries of most of people who practice in medicine, and one of my colleagues, Winston Chung, is clearly very, very good at this. I think the tension between the need for privacy and the need for access is one of the main threads that continually dominates this debate in the healthcare arena. And I think tension is something that we move away from sometimes. I think like a good stringed instrument, the right tension can generate a beautiful note. When there's not quite the right tension, it generates a sour note. And if it's too tense, then clearly it can break and not generate anything at all. We do see patients going online and sharing data very readily, whereas there is still a reticence amongst healthcare providers to look at ways of sharing data. And in the manuscript that we quoted there, the basic data elements were really derived from one provincial database in Alberta and extrapolated, if you like, across the country, making many assumptions. I think some of the people on the call have been very instrumental in trying to make data more accessible across a country like Canada. It is not isolated to Canada, but it is something that we need to work on. One other thing that I think has come to light really with the onset of new electronic medical records, and something that's been highlighted again as we design clinical trials from my position now at Amgen, is trying to balance the need to collect as much data as possible, but also making it possible to do so in a timely fashion. When we collect data, patient-reported outcome data and clinical trials, we want to collect as much data as possible, but we're very aware of the time that we're asking patients to devote to the exercise. So we're trying to minimize things to about 30, 40 minutes, which in some people's mind is still too much. The expectation that electronic medical records can answer all these questions is a little bit facile, I think, because it often assumes that people at the front line have the time and energy to pour all that information in with a regularity, reliability, and consistency, whereas that may not always be true. And I think sometimes the tendency is to find ways to bypass things that are too onerous. So again, I think things like depth of detail, the extractability, insistence on quality and an ability to share data as much as possible are the ongoing themes, I think, that dominate that debate.
Gwyn, thanks for that. And I think, that gives us a really nice foundation to build on, and a couple of other things, the notion of tension, the notion of trust, the notion of speed, that I think we really want to kind of try to come back to over the course of this conversation. But let me sort of broaden it up. And maybe Barry, I'll give you sort of first kick of the can of picking up on some of the themes that Gwyn just sort of laid down. I know you're involved in a number of important and exciting developments across the country that sort of sit at that intersection of access and data. Do you want to talk about the areas that give you the most optimism and maybe some of the things that a broader audience would benefit from being engaged in?
Sure, and thanks for the invitation to be here, Ross, and really proud to be part of the Resilient Healthcare Coalition and to provide, from colorectal cancer's perspective, our ready for the next round perspective as well. I suddenly feel, seeing everybody on the screen, that I'm probably the least qualified to talk about this today. So I'm happy to give my point of view, however. As Gwyn was saying, the pandemic has showed us a lot of new possibilities. I think opened our eyes to so many new possibilities, and one was speed. That we could do things much faster than ever before, and 7 months come up with a vaccine. And that was done by sharing data, by adaptive trials, new way of doing trials. And as Greg Simon pointed out recently to us, we have to learn to do things twice as much in half the amount of time in order to keep up with the pace of the new innovations. And I noticed today that IQVIA came out and they showed that just last year alone, 30 new innovations came up in oncology, which are which are being tested today in hundreds of different trials. So the innovation in terms of precision medicine is accelerating right now, and our regulatory and HTA systems are unfortunately not ready for that. We're not keeping pace with these new innovations. So we have to really say, what did we learn from the pandemic in terms of resiliency? How do we have a more resilient healthcare system? And how can we adapt to the lessons learned from the pandemic? So I mentioned about the adaptive trials, but one of the true sort of new experiences that we're seeing is new partnerships in Canada. I call it the new PPP, and that is between public, private, and patient groups. So PPP, that's the new PPP. And we have a great example of that with BC Cancer and Roche and CFIN going on with the project called Predict in British Columbia, something that sort of sets out the perspective of conditional approvals of new innovation subject to the collection of real-world data, and how both the public agencies and private companies can work together in order to bring these new innovations forward so that patients can gain early access to this. And this is something that we've discussed across the country. Yesterday we did this, or the other day with the Quebec politicians as well. How do we get, why should patients have to wait for even innovations which are recommended for reimbursement to go through this entire process of negotiation and so forth? We have to find faster ways to time to listing, so to speak, in Canada, in the Canadian context. Patients who are waiting 3 years for treatments, we can cut that in half to 1.5 years. Just do your job in half the amount of time without changing anything. I just want to talk about a couple of other things. One is the access to data. One of the things that the pandemic has showed us that we need live data to make fast decisions when the system is hit with something like COVID-19 or any other factor that hits it. So one of the projects that came out of our Ready for the Next Round roundtables is putting together a live experiment in live data with the University of Calgary and Darren Brenner. So we're happy to see that there is a possibility to take data from our public healthcare systems and utilize that and get live data. So don't work on things that are 10 years old or even a year old. We need to be able to access data in that fashion. And finally, one of the foundations of the Canadian Personalized Healthcare Innovation Network is, as Gwyn mentioned, the utilization of aggregate and anonymous data that can be shared, left in its space where it is, and shared between centers such as UHN and Tom Baker, and you're referring to Winston Chung, of course, in that example. We have to learn how not only to get these data sets from various types of information, whether it's hospital records or whether it's CT scans or molecular profiles, share this type of data throughout the country in order to accelerate research. So I think I'll leave it with that.
Barry, thanks for that. Louise, I'm going to come to you in a sec, but I just want to call attention and compliment the folks who are jumping into the chat. I think there's some really important things that are being mentioned. Paul, thank you for sort of pinning Judy Glennie's report, which is completely spot on this particular conversation. And Judy, as probably all of us know, is a thoughtful, informed, and really savvy observer of both, the current world we live in and what a better one could look like. So thank you for that. And Lee and Felicia, your comments about models that are existing in other parts of the world we could borrow from, I think is really important. And obviously the centrality of patients in this whole conversation and this notion of it doesn't have to be either or, it needs to be actually both. We need both, appropriate privacy, but also maximum openness. So Louise, I know, from a patient perspective and certainly from a data perspective, this is something you've thought a lot about. And in particular, I've heard you muse quite eloquently about the notion of sort of patient rights to data and how central and important that sort of concept of rights can be in this conversation, and ways in which it needs to be sort of protected and strengthened in order to support patients having the active, engaged role in these conversations they need to have and deserve to have. Can you unpack that a little bit and sort of share some of your thoughts on that with
Sure.
With this broader group?
I'd be pleased to, and hello to the folks I know on this call. I've seen seen a number of names that I know quite well, and for those I don't, it's a pleasure to meet all of you. If anybody had told me even 2 years ago that my eyes would light up at the sound of the word data, I would have said, you got the wrong girl. I was and have always been interested in access to treatments for patients, always in my work. And my eyes certainly lit up when I started to hear about precision medicine in oncology and the importance of immunotherapies and ensuring that the old methods of chemotherapy and radiation, while they certainly still have a big place in our armamentarium, can be replaced in some cases by real game changers that are so much safer and more effective for patients. And not only that, even though I'm no scientist, it's very clear to me that if the right drug is going to patients who really will benefit from them, that's wonderful. It also keeps people from taking ineffective and really difficult to take medications for no reason at all, and allows them to find a better way to deal with the issues that they have in health. And it's also wasteful for the system. So, this really is a PPP win. And of course, I put the first P as patients and the other two after. But I love that idea, Barry, of the 3 Ps. So it started to come to me probably late in the game compared to a lot of the rest of you, that if we really want patients to support research, and we desperately need them, and we desperately need them to be willing to provide real world evidence of how they're experiencing treatments today, they need to feel confident that the data that they provide will not only be well used, but will also be protected. So how do we create that balance? The way we decided to jump into it was through the Patients Redefining Healthcare Summit. And there was a lot of conversation. You may know that there are a couple of groups, including Save Your Skin Foundation, that co-invite folks every year to a summit. And I hope you'll come this year, all of you. It's the week of November 14th, and we have fascinating topics, including a whole day on Indigenous health, which is often overlooked in these conversations. And so we set up a working group to deal with data. What should we do about data? And we decided that what we needed to do was to develop a declaration of patient rights to data that properly balances individual identifiable protection of data, but also ensures that patients feel comfortable and happy to provide their data, and particularly de-identified data, so that we can do the research. You can't do the research without us. You can't learn the real world evidence without us. You certainly don't want any barriers. And if people sense that their protection may not be safe as a barrier, we have to remove that barrier. So we created what we call the Declaration of Personal Health Data Rights in Canada. And we were very fortunate on this working group to have some really amazing expertise, not only in patient care, but also in data collection, and including someone who actually runs his own private data collection organization that started in Alberta. So we were in on the ground floor on both sides. What came out was a document that has, it's founded, of course, on the legal framework set by the Supreme Court of Canada. And I wouldn't be a lawyer if I didn't look at the law first, in 1992, that said that people do own their own personal health data. Heaven knows, I wouldn't have thought we needed the Supreme Court to tell us that, but apparently we did. While stewards of those data own the records themselves. So how are we defining stewards? They're anyone who holds personal health data. And it's a very broad swath, including social service providers, corporations, government agencies, researchers, and nonprofit organizations, and probably many more. And as we move into AI, that's going to be a very interesting discussion about the data that goes through those organizations as well. So this means that people, the Supreme Court said that if you own it, you have access to it and control on its ongoing use going forward. So as I said, we recognize and we support as patients and patient groups the need for our data to be available for public health purposes. And we've certainly learned a lot about the importance of it there in the last few years, as well as for research purposes. So the declaration provides a blueprint to ensure that the stewards of these data respect, protect, and fulfill their personal data rights. And it is very specific about our right to be informed about the collection of these data, the right to consent and withdraw consent for the use of these data, especially for commercialization of our data, and the right to access, portability, and correction, among others. But we also are very clear in the document that as long as our data are de-identified, we want to make it available to benefit research, and as long as there's privacy and security around those data. So this is good for everybody, in my opinion, and in the opinion of 26 other national patient and related organizations who have already signed on to this declaration as a blueprint that they support. We'd like to recommend that you take a look in the chat at the declaration. If you feel it's a document that you also can support, we'd be delighted to have more of you sign on. I'm very honored to say that as a result of this work, many of us involved with this work have been invited to work with a number of data projects that are very important to Canada, including the Public Health Agency of Canada's data management strategy, and the CPAC and Canadian Cancer Society data work, as well as many others. So just in closing, I think it's clear that an integrated, comprehensive, pan-Canadian data strategy, including data rights, is good for cancer patients, it's good for cancer research, it's good for public health. And I think that as long as patients have confidence that their data are being used well and protected, they're going to feel very comfortable to be engaged in providing it for research purposes, which is so desperately needed. So that's my pitch for our declaration.
Thank you, Louise and Barry and Gwyn. Eva, I know you want to, I know you're chomping at the bit to talk about VBHC, or value-based healthcare, which is of course another incredibly important component of this data conversation. If, with your permission, because you are sort of our closing speaker to usher us out just before 1 o'clock, I'm gonna ask you to weave your VBHC's thoughts into those closing remarks. And with your permission and others, I think we should open the floor to the broader group that's assembled here. So just a couple of reminders from me. If you are comfortable putting on your camera, we would love to see you and not just hear you. And if you are comfortable renaming yourself from Victoria Chappelle, if you've accidentally ended up with the wrong name, hover your cursor over the top right corner of your screen. You'll see 3 dots and you can rename yourself there. So with that, if folks want to sort of flag themselves by putting their virtual hands up, I'd be very happy to open the floor to this broader conversation. We've got a lot of catalytic comments already from the participants we've heard from. And certainly, I mean, there was one kind of teaser question, a very large one that we floated to folks before they even got on the line. And it's really the question about sort of the biggest obstacles to better sharing and leveraging data to improve cancer care across Canada. What are the obstacles and how can we best address them? Now, you can take that question literally in any of dozens, if not hundreds of directions. So it's my pleasure to sort of open the microphone to anyone who'd like to pick up on this great conversation in the chat and the great presentations and discussions in the roundtable thus far. So who wants to kick us off?
Well, I could certainly say to Sarah's question that no, I think that patients often don't recognize the value of their information and what an important asset it is, both in the public health and research field, as well as in their own personal care. And so the more that we can do to help them understand that and also feel protected in providing it, the better we'll be. And as to Angela's question, there's so many answers to Angela's question. I think we need to start right from the clinical trial processes and the approval processes for clinical trials, and learn from the best practices of the pandemic. We seem to be able to whip them through pretty quickly when it came to vaccines, including Health Canada's ability suddenly to do rolling reviews, which they said they've never been able to do in 25 years, but suddenly they were able to do them. And I could go on with quite a long list of using phase 2 data to provide conditional availability and then following the real world evidence in the phase 3 trials. I could go on, and I'd love to because
Louise, I'm going to go to Angela, who's actually got her hand up. And so perfect timing, great segue. Thank you, Angela.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks to the esteemed panelists. Really interesting to hear your perspectives. I was struck by Gwyn's story, the recollection from his perspective on the actual impact of delays for cancer care. And Barry also mentioned having the time. I think for us, it's, for us in this world, we know where the problems exist and potentially what the solutions are, but how do we get the policymakers and the people in charge to really care and pay attention, even as really this issue seems to get drowned out by so many other pressing concerns? How do we make policymakers pay attention to the need for a more simplified and quicker process for access to medicines?
Thanks, Angela.
So I could maybe just answer some of that. Very briefly. I mean, while there are many different things along the pipeline, so to speak, that that sort of slow down the process of access to new medications, I don't think it's the time from a clinical trial until regulatory that can be sped up, but science is science. But there are artificial barriers that happen both at regulatory and at the HTA and PCPA side that block, for a very long period of time, the access to the new innovation. So just at that point, from regulatory, HTA, and PCPA, if we could reform that point, or have the time there, that would make a big difference. And we've learned that that's possible through Project Orbis, with the FDA, being able to get drugs listed and with the help of Health Canada very quickly. So I think those are some of the lessons and opportunities.
Barry, thanks for that. I've been seeing a ton of great comments coming in on the chat, and I'm gonna sort of tap folks on the shoulder and see if they would like to elaborate a bit on some of the things that they've dropped in there. And Paul, if I can, maybe I'll start with you. You talked about the importance of RWE and some examples of sort of multi-site initiatives that are undergoing or that are being undertaken to sort of support the collection and optimization of RWE. And you talked about some patient-reported outcome measures and some experience measures. You want to expand on that at all and talk about sort of from the lung space what you're seeing and what you're excited about?
Sure. Yeah, delighted to be on this call today. I was just tapping away as you called me in response to Project Orbis, because I have two hats: a lung cancer hat and then a sort of drug access interest. Project Orbis does get things through Health Canada quickly, but then we still have to deal with PMPRB, CADTH, PCPA, and increasingly all of them now seem to want to have a voice on how much a drug is going to cost, which just kind of muddies the water and makes it more challenging. So I think, having communities like this, sort of pan-oncology, tumor site agnostic, if you like, or with a common voice on, let's get rid of PMPRB, for example. They're redundant. I mean, they have, in my view, nothing that they add to the picture other than delays. Anyway, sorry, you asked about real-world evidence. So, that's become increasingly important. CADTH are using real-world evidence. They want to see Canadian context data in a lot of their submissions. Louise mentioned phase 2 data. In lung cancer, there's, as Gwyn knows well, multiple rare subtypes of lung cancer now, which occur in 1% of the population. There's just, tens of patients, or maybe 100 or so, but not enough for randomized data. And so we have seen some progress with CADTH accepting phase 2 and single-arm studies recently, or over the last couple of years, but they're inconsistent, which drives everyone crazy. So there's a new drug called tepotinib for a rare lung cancer subtype, which has just been provisionally rejected, which is inconsistent with previous decisions. So I think, those are some of the frustrations. When developing real-world evidence will allow us to provide some of that context. Jeff Liu in Toronto is leading an initiative called CARMA-BROS, Canadian Rare Molecular Abnormalities, something. We're doing the couple that I mentioned, PALEOS, Pan-Canadian Lung Observational Study. Right now it's really Pan-Ontario, but we've got other centers that are going to join in Quebec and Nova Scotia to start with. Cascade, which Gwyn was involved in the small cell lung cancer, where already with the small cell lung cancer database, even though we've only got, of the 9 centers, only got data from 4, we already have the biggest small cell lung cancer real world evidence database in the world that we're aware of. And so, this can be very powerful for industry. It can be helpful for research. It can be helpful for regulatory purposes. it can be helpful with new drugs being investigated in that space. So I think it is a positive that we're doing in Canada. We have a very collegial lung cancer group across the country. Lung Cancer Canada has been involved in promoting a lot of that and supporting a lot of this, and plus the academic groups. So, you know, lots of frustrations as we're seeing here, but I think there are paths forward for sure.
Paul, thanks for that. I appreciate you managing different sort of conversations in the chat and in real time. So I appreciate your comments. Felicia, I want to go to you, and then Lee Stevenson, I'd love to come to you after that, because you raised some interesting points about the concept of governance and the importance of getting governance right, which is both on the face of it a seemingly self-evident notion and also incredibly amorphous and challenging. So if you don't mind maybe expounding on that a little bit, that'd be great. But Felicia, over to you next.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ross, and thanks for having me today. So for those who don't know me, I'm Felicia with AstraZeneca, and listening to Dr. Whitley Price talk about the challenges that we face with uncertainty is, I think, a lot of the conversation in this space. But going back to Angela's question about how do we get people to care, one of the biggest challenges that I see in health economics and all of the calculations we try and do to figure out how we're going to pay for and value these drugs is that we as a society, if we are valuing people who are perceived to be at the end of their lives, then it's not really coming through in the math. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges. You know, decision makers are loath to treat people with aggressive cancers aggressively, which seems to be kind of backwards because their prognosis is so poor. But, you know, I actually just saw a patient yesterday, and I don't know how many share this view, talk about how prognosis is not of interest to them and actually should not be information that's even given to a patient unless they're asked. Because no single human can say what is really in store for any person. And we all know those people who were told they had 6 months to live and are here, you know, 13 or 20 years later. Some of you are on the line today. And so, you know, as a society, I think we have some serious values questions about how we treat and value people at the end of life that hopefully will be carried forward into the future of, you know, health economics and pharmacoeconomics in our system.
Thank you, Felicia. That, yeah, that, I mean, we could do a whole other hour on just that. So maybe we should, and we'll think a little bit about that question of how we treat sort of disease progression, disease state, and what that means for our willingness to throw everything into the mix versus our reticence for doing that, for those who maybe need them the most.
And I just wanted to add one thing for frame of reference, right? Please. Is that this is what the COVID conversation, I think, really helped us to talk about, especially with regards to long-term care, right? It became clear that we weren't valuing people in long-term care homes because they were at the end of their lives. So, you know, what do we have to learn from that in cancer? I just think it's very relevant to the COVID conversation as well.
Yeah, thanks for bringing it back to that. Lee, do you want to unpack governance a little bit, or do you want me to keep going?
Unpack governance.
How's that for an easy request?
No problem. No, yeah. I'll just make a little pitch and point at some, I think, really important work that probably everyone here is already familiar with, and it's been in the chat already. But I mean, and it's to that question of sort of the biggest challenge to moving forward with health data, but also as an opportunity, which I think is exciting. And it is, you know, it's because we have an abundance of data, as has already been referenced, and there's more and more needed, real world evidence, all the rest of it, et cetera. What we have a challenge, you know, it's the data quality, okay, you know, the standards and the interoperability. Okay, so there's a lot that needs to be had in terms of just getting all of the various actors from the various sectors, including, of course, patients and citizens, working together towards some common goals and making, you know, coherent strategic decisions together. They'll be different, you know, in different jurisdictions, or even if you're doing this within one jurisdiction, but really our data has to travel across the country to even, you know, we won't touch the globe, but obviously there's trends happening internationally too, which it would make sense to think about in the context of doing this kind of foundational work, because the data flow obviously is not just even within the borders of Canada in order to get the maximum benefit for people and for the systems, providers, systems, researchers, et cetera, the whole ecosystem. So the challenge and the need to work together over the long term, not just in political cycles, and bringing all those right players together to come to consensus on how are we moving forward, what do we need to do, and taking those steps together over time. So the exciting part is, and the links have been shared, is that there is, because of the pandemic and the huge challenges with just collecting the basic data for managing the pandemic, and you know, the poor quality and comparability of the data that was being cobbled together across the different jurisdictions through this, has created a level of urgency and attention across the different jurisdictions and within the federal government, which has led to the creation of the expert advisory group for the Pan-Canadian Health Data Strategy, which has been referenced earlier. Louise mentioned health management strategy nationally, and the links are in there. But so their third report really does put together, you know, the first few reports are really laying out the issues and sort of the current state and where things need to go. And then the third report really puts together a draft vision, set of objectives, immediate tactics that need to happen, and talk about that whole piece around governance using, you know, they specifically mentioned collective impact, but they put together specific recommendations on working across the different jurisdictions and across the different stakeholders on this issue for the, you know, to create consensus on a strategy, a vision, a set of priorities, and a way of moving forward together over time. And I just think it's important for us all to be aware that that's happening and to support it, because there's just all of these foundational pieces that need to be brought together and made coherent for long-term success, ultimately. Otherwise, we're just going to keep creating amazing pockets of data and information, but never being able to really properly work across and have a real flowing ecosystem of data.
Lee, it's a perfect segue, and thank you for flagging the Pan-Canadian work, because just to maybe a quick hype for the Resilient Healthcare Coalition. So we have been in touch with Eric Sutherland, who many people on this call know, if not all, who's the sort of lead of the secretariat that supported the creation of the Pan-Canadian Health Data Strategy documents. And we will be meeting with that team next month, actually, to hear more about their work to date and ways in which we can hopefully serve as a convener and a podium and a catalyst for more conversations with folks like all of you that can then be simplified and integrated and connected with people in government who actually have to implement the strategy laid out in those documents. So hopefully we will stay in touch with all of you on many things, including the possibility of supporting and engaging with that work. Gwyn, I'm going to give you, you know, just a minute or two to sort of pick up on anything that you've heard over the last sort of 20, 25 minutes or so from your particular bifurcated perspective and your new Amgen role. And then after you, I will give Eva the opportunity to close this fantastic conversation out. So to the two of you.
Thanks again, Ross, and thanks to everybody for their fantastic input. I feel very privileged right now because I'm working in a role that is able to draw on all the aspects of experience that I acquired while I was a clinician and a researcher, clinical trialist, and somebody running a laboratory and trying to plow my way through real world evidence. No wonder I didn't get very far, because I became a master of none, right? Jack of all trades. Nonetheless, I think the experience has been fantastic. I think, you know, one of the things that we're trying to do at the University of Calgary was to foster innovation and get innovative ideas and drugs out into the market, as they say. I think working for a company like Amgen, that is exactly what we're doing. And I think I'm really enjoying that right now. And one of the things that's, I think, you know, for us all to think about, you know, guidelines and peer review are very important. But if you're looking for a recipe for innovation, following guidelines and getting approval from all your peers that this is, you know, a sensible thing to do is not the good recipe. So we have to find ways of having a gentle abrasiveness that allows us to kind of float above that somehow and push these things forward. And I'll end up with an Amgen example of KRAS, which is for a long time, by most clinicians and many scientists, be felt to be an undruggable target. And then some crazy people look at the crystallography structure of this target, not in its stable form, but in its slightly open form, and realize that there is a pocket that is targetable. And so we have what represents a very big step forward in the treatment of a possibility for many lung cancer patients. And that in turn has been taken on to develop drugs to fight COVID. So all these innovations, these creativities and things need to be fostered. They need to be seen as opportunities to have a very broad applicability. And maybe the collegiality that Paul referred to is something that we preserve, but sometimes we need a little bit of edginess to push it forward in Canada.
I think if we can all take the concept of gentle abrasiveness away from this conversation and think about the ways in which we can bring that to our own engagement and advocacy efforts, that's a lovely turn of phrase. So Gwyn, thanks for that. I will just flag for folks, we are recording this roundtable to turn it into a podcast. So there will be an audio recording available ideally on Monday. We will push it back out to all of you, but obviously please feel free to share it more broadly with colleagues and friends. And we'll certainly keep you informed of all things RHC over the next, the coming weeks and the coming months. So with that, Eva Villalba, would you like to close us out and send us to the rest of our days?
Yes, thank you. You didn't give me much time, but I will try to summarize and talk about the key takeaways for me. I think that, one of the main highlights of what we discussed today is how do we get decision makers to actually care about access issues that are affecting, people with cancer, people with multiple diseases. We did talk about raising awareness, but I think one of the main things that luckily is actually happening is currently we base our decisions based on cost alone and on volume. And I think that we need to shift from volume to value, from cost to value. There is a shift happening now, a paradigm shift. And in order to actually start making decisions based on value, we need good data. And we need to collect data, and not just any type of data, but good quality data in real time that actually reflects what matters most to patients above all, but also the entire continuum of care. And this relates to precision medicine, because for precision medicine to actually actualize its power and promise, we need to actually give the right treatment to the right patient at the right time. We can only do that with the right data, but also the right incentives in our system. And so I think that there's a great shift happening now. I think, one thing that we skirted, but we didn't talk about too much, and it's a topic of interest for me and many people here, I believe, is outcome-based agreements. I think that that's one way to accelerate access while at the same time collecting some of that data, which will, kind of mitigate some of that uncertainty. But at the same time, we need to recognize all of the perspectives, kind of use these outcome-based agreements to actually mitigate some of that financial burden as well, which will create a more resilient healthcare system, because we see that the challenge also of precision medicine is that it threatens to explode the healthcare budgets in spending. So how do we get both? How do we get timely access to innovative treatments when patients need it, but at the same time understand and mitigate that financial burden? I think that outcome-based agreements are one of the ways, but also making decisions based on, by spending more on a right diagnostic test and a precision drug, are we actually saving the entire healthcare system costs in terms of unnecessary hospitalizations, complications, long-term impacts like death? And these people are no longer paying taxes to support the healthcare system. So I think that shift to value is really going to be key. We can only do that through health data. And again, I think that the RHC as a convener of all of these perspectives is really key, so that we can not just have these conversations, but actually think about concrete solutions for moving this forward and making a lasting healthcare transformation. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here.
Amazing. Thank you, Eva. Thank all of you. And I hope that we see you all again under the RHC banner and others over the coming weeks and months. This stuff's important, and we will keep talking about it, and we look forward to working and engaging with all of you. Take care and have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks, Ross. Wonderful conclusion, Eva.